This question is mainly directed at Dr. Kirkpatrick. So you talked about the enhancements and the way people might perceive those enhancements, such as like destroying the courage or effort put into it compared to someone else. But the way I kind of saw it in some way, or at least this is some way it could be seen, is computers and other technologies have helped enhance human activities and replace previous methods of doing things and making them easier. And that's expanded the way humans learn and do various different activities. So what I wanted to ask is this a removal of effort or destruction of courage or other aspects, or is it simply opening up new avenues to realize human potential? Thanks.
Thanks. That's a very good question. In my view, it's not, which I didn't have an opportunity to really explicate. And actually, this is something Tony and I were talking about, was the sort of the relationship between enhancement and the enhancement of particular forms of dignity. There seems to be the possibility that that there is something different about than using an assistive tool like a calculator or a computer, which often allows us to kind of optimize our performance, but not enhance it in the way that philosophers usually understand the term. I think it's, we've seen it play out, and Pistorius was mentioned in sports, right? The sort of notion of fairness and what counts as an enhancement or an augmentation and what doesn't. So I think that the rub is sort of where the enhancement is occurring, what the competitive advantage is. Is it open? Is it transparent? Is it, do we, some advocates, some philosophers from Oxford, for example, argue that that we should allow doping outright in sports, right? That's an example. Allow everyone to dope, to be, to reach a high level of enhancement so that there are no one's cheating, is one potential example. But many people find that uncomfortable. So in my view, there isn't. But I think in going to the keynote that preceded us is one of the questions that I think one of the points that will probably win the day is the question of narrative. So I have my own views as a philosopher, but if the general public views enhancements writ large as something that is creepy and deleterious and destructive, then that's going to decide, not me.
I'm not going to directly try to address the point where suggested that soldiers can't give informed consent. I'll leave that one for someone else. But essentially, one of the suggestions that I took away, and this can be addressed to all the panelists up there, is that a prerequisite of super soldiers might be, in fact, looking at super leaders. The enhancements or optimizations would require so much monitoring, so much intelligence to know how to use properly, that maybe before we can even develop a super soldier, we need super leaders.
Right. I'll take a stab. I'll take a stab at it. I guess I'd have to, but I guess I need to ask the question back to you. It kind of goes back to what our definitions are. What do you mean by a super leader? Do you mean that the leader has to have the same kind of enhancements, or does the leader have to have enhancements that are unique to leadership? And this is something we wrestled at Unified Quest, I think 2 Unified Quests ago. What, at the general officer level, what kind of traits and attributes would a leader need 30 years from now to confront a very different kind of warfare? And that's a worthy question. I don't have the list we came up with at the top of my head. I will say it was slightly different because there was an assumption about not just increased complexity, but different kinds of complexity, which requires attention to different kinds of concerns where perhaps, decisiveness, for instance, might be subordinated to reflection, might be worth, it might be worth slowing down operations or slowing down the decision-making process in order to develop more options, and the kind of attributes and traits that allow someone to see the kind of options that are there and process all that kind of information. So if you're thinking about that, I think that's right, and I think you have to, I think your point's really sound, that in parallel to tracking the impact of soldier enhancements over time, you have to track the leadership requirements over time and determine in advance how to meet them, because you might not be growing those kinds of folks in time to have them. I will segue real quick. If just to clarify, I didn't say soldiers couldn't give informed consent. My point was there are conditions where if you put someone in one of these, choice they can't refuse, that's a kind of coercion. So it almost doesn't matter how much they know and understand.
That's great.
It's kind of irrelevant. So the ethical response is to make it relevant again. That's basically all I was saying.
So,
Anybody else?
yes. If you have a commander who believes he has to take his target and he has a certain force to do that achievement or to monitor a group or control an environment, his doctrine is fit to the soldier and the soldier decision-making as we now have the human being. If you take the modified soldier, and we're talking about modified to a level beyond which the highest percentage of the bell curve operator is driven beyond that. That cognitive and functional change requires a different understanding of superhuman behavior and the consequence of commanding that super operator to do something that he or she or nobody has done before. That's a different doctrine, has to be a different doctrine. And in order to get that, you need a different kind of a commander. That's the point.
So I just wanted to ask, taking into account the voluntary aspects of the ethical considerations put forward, as well as the sort of the effects that human performance, be it neurological or physical, have on the relationships, intermilitary or the ethos of these relationships, as you mentioned, resentment, etc. How do you believe human performance enhancement will change not only the operational environments themselves, be it in combat, but also the future nature and mandates of these operations, given the risks that differ between those who are enhanced and those who are not? Thank you.
You need a commander who talks about that. Yeah.
I'll take a stab at that one, because another really excellent question. A lot of it, of course, is going to depend on what kind of enhancements that we undertake. And as I was researching for this particular project, some that I thought interesting that came to mind, or ones I ran across, are neural implants that allow you to feel what a robot is touching. That allows for remote, that allows you to employ the robot remotely, which I think we've already got that for like EOD purposes. But you can imagine we're maybe not be too far away, and at least I know they're working on something that then might allow you to, basically control your Terminator from afar. That's going to reduce the risk to the soldier, obviously, in a way that I think is going to have profound effects on how we view soldiering. And in general, and that doesn't mean there's not a hard. I mean, and drone pilots are actually pretty good, baseline or a reference point for this, because it's not that. It may be that they don't go through the same kinds of hardship that us. I'm a former infantry officer. They don't go through the same kind of crap that we might have gone through, but that doesn't mean there's not hardship. It doesn't mean that there's not some kind of sacrifice. It doesn't mean there's not some kind of effort being expended that's worth noting. But that is going to be, I think, change over time, and actually have a profound effect on how we view the military. Now, but in terms of the operational environment, well, I mean, think about it this way: if I'm actually remote and I'm not afraid, I might actually think a little bit more carefully about what I shoot at. So you could actually see reduction in collateral harm. On the other hand, if I'm not able to perceive my environment, my situational awareness is compromised because of the remote connection, I might do something that I might make decisions based on incomplete information. So those are problems, that technically we'd have to solve. But actually, I think a lot of this, to the extent it reduces the human foibles that all of this is trying to overcome, could actually make the operational environment perhaps more humane. And what will that do for the future, nature and mandates of the missions? That's a really hard one to answer because it literally depends on what the adversary's doing. But what I think it does is allows us to probably economize in certain areas, be a little bit more efficient. And again, it depends on what kind of capabilities that the enemy has. But to the extent we have these enhancements and the enemy doesn't, then it's a little easier for us to overmatch with less. And I think those are at least two insights I can provide to that excellent question. Anybody else?
Yeah. Again, with haptic sensing, you don't need brain implants. We have today haptic sensing of all sorts, which give you the permission to feel pressure, and we're doing this in the laboratory, without anything going into your brain. Well, nothing with wires going in your brain. The sensory and the motor system, of course, is connected from the fingers, right? So the brain is receiving and processing it, but it's not wires into your head.
I was looking forward to the wires in my head because I thought.
I'll add very briefly. Tony unwittingly stole my idea of drone operators, but I think the other place to look. So this is a way to not answer the question, but to provide some current and past cases that may provide us an answer looking forward, and that's I think cyber. So and especially for non-kinetic usage, and for those that are sitting in the safety of a suburb outside Washington D.C. Are they cyber warriors? What does that mean? And I think that's one place to look, and the jury is still out.
That's a good point.
I'm going to break my rule and comment on this one because there's two aspects of ethics that have to do with this automating or enhancing to where we have a noticed advantage, and that we execute the fight from a distance, and potentially even from a distance amongst the population. We introduce two points of consideration. The first one is it fair? And this gets to the proportionality argument. I personally don't have a problem with fighting unfair. I want the greatest advantage, although I do know ethicists that believe that when you do have an advantage that your opponent doesn't, that it is profoundly unfair to engage them that way. I spent 30 years as a soldier. I want to be in an unfair fight. So I don't subscribe to that. One that is more gnarly, more complex, and it gets at the drone operators now and in the future, very near future, to cyber warriors. The fact that we execute those missions for the U.S., from the United States, for Canada, from Canada, and we go home at night to our families, that we go to Walmart and shop at a store, we have identified ourselves as warriors, as combatants. And to the extent that our enemies don't have the sophistication to be able to limit collateral damage, you can make a very ethical argument that the collateral damage would be acceptable within their capability to fight back, to destroy the warrior, the combatant. And we have to be very careful as we have this unfair advantage, particularly when we employ our systems from a distance, particularly when that from a distance includes amongst our civilian population, that we don't establish moral or ethical precedent that allows our enemy a narrative that says we deserve it. What's good for the goose kind of a thing. When they start using drones or cyber to attack us in Walmart or our financial systems and so forth. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was curious, the point was brought up about doping in sports and how for most of us that would just seem wrong to have all athletes doped up. And I was curious about the separate standards that we would set for the military and civilian life and different requirements in enhancement and what might be applicable for the military, not so for civilian life. But my concern is as the technology progresses and becomes more advanced, don't you either reach a point where the technology becomes disseminated among the civilian population,
yes,
or you have the military become so out of touch and so differentiated from the civilians as the enhancements become more and more developed and more radical? So aren't you forced to choose between one or the other, where either you have an enhanced general society or just a super soldier military that's a species into itself beyond the civilian population?
So yes and no. I don't think it's a binary choice. So I'll give an answer by way of comparison. I'm not a member of Special Forces. I don't get that training as a civilian. I don't know how to, there's lots of things that we give to the military to do their jobs that I as a civilian shouldn't and don't expect to be able to acquire, right? Including, from the States, I guess we often do acquire assault rifles, but I'll leave my opinions on that untouched at the moment. But there are certain things, right? I'm not allowed to go and buy a tank at the store. In the same way that there'll be some enhancements that we are going to want to, if that's the road we decide to go down, to make available to people that could be those that lead to greater quality of life or increased well-being, that just make good sense. And there's certainly going to be some that we don't, right? Just in the same way that there are certain types of training and equipment that we provide the military now, but we don't provide for civilian populations. And drawing where that line is going to be tricky. It's part of it'll be a question up to sort of democratic society. But I think it's a little bit of both. I don't think that, but I do share your concern that and the premise of the question, which is that there's already such a large divide between the civ-mil divide, especially in the United States, right? Less than 1% serve. That if what do you do how do you address that concern, which is an appropriate one, while not still equipping Sarah down the street with stuff that she doesn't need?
Yeah, a slightly different perspective. There's such a thing as normative behaviors. We go today from a normative behavior where nobody has things sticking in their head intentionally done by society, by police, by military. The normative thing when daddy comes home or mommy comes home and has wires sticking in the head, that now is a different state of what's okay. And when they're back home, reintegrated in society with the wires in the head and with every other modification we can conceive of, that now is no longer a person in the military. That's daddy, mommy. And so the progressive effect of everything we're doing has to have a civilian and social, at least on the second generation, if not on the first.
Yeah, I'd just add that on the case of alienating the military from society, I think we're pretty far along on that already, at least in the U.S. So enhancements may accelerate that, but you raised two other concerns I thought were pretty interesting. Because once you have enhanced soldiers, and I touched on this in my presentation, but once you have enhanced soldiers that are going to get integrated back into society, and if those enhancements are permanent, it's not just going through, we have a transition program where they help you find a job, and then you're, and you get your, bonus pay or whatever, and you go off and you work, and you're a normal member of society. You're not going to be that. So that's something that people are going to have to pay attention to. I also, I totally agree with Jesse that, certainly there's major weapon systems that, certain dangerous things I can't acquire, but military technology, when the military develops part of the reason you also don't buy it is because the tank's not terribly useful in an apartment in New York City. If you're living in an apartment in New York City, parking is awful. Or DC, where I live sometimes. When it is useful to civilians, it does have a tendency to spread throughout the society in general, which is going to create a whole bunch of interesting effects, and something that, again, it's a ethical concern that's going to have to be managed as these technologies developed and are acquired. So I thought that was a good question.
Yeah, that's a good, just really briefly, that's a really good point. And I think that, we saw with all the, I forget what the title is of the program, right? But the remaining material that from Iraq that came back, and we now see in U.S. police forces, right? The pretty shocking pictures of Ferguson, where someone's on a Bearcat pointing a military-grade sniper rifle at a bunch of unarmed civilians. So you can imagine that the trickle-down, downstream effects of this are going to be right, not only to the civilian population, but to police forces as well, which hadn't occurred to me till just this moment.